To open our program this evening, it gives me great pleasure to invite to the stage Koç University President Professor Umran Inan.
Mr. Ambassador, Ms. Christina Lambropoulou, and esteemed guests, I'm very pleased to welcome you all here and for this very exciting opening of our Center for Late Antique and Byzantine Studies. It's an important moment in the historical development of Koç University, and I think it's an important instance also in the development of the exploration of the common heritage of our peoples. And I'm very pleased that after many years of not having a center of this type in the land of Anatolia and in Turkey, we now are able to launch one. I came to Koç University from Stanford University, where I spent about 36 years, and I came here about 5 to 6 years ago. And I have since then been wanting to set up a center like this, because obviously this is the land of the Byzantine and the land of the cultural heritage that we all share, and it needs to be explored. And again, obviously, it wasn't explored in ways that it can be, not brought forth for various other reasons. So now that we have formed this really incredible partnership with our colleagues from Stavros Niarchos Foundation, we are able to set on a path that I think will allow us to bring out the archaeological and history of art treasures of this region and that period in human history. I'm really very excited about it. Stavros Niarchos Foundation provides funding to us for 5 years to bring this center up, after which time we expect and hope to have it funded by outside sources, such as the European Union and other sources of research funding. And then again, with the help of the foundation, we will hopefully endow it for perpetuity, so that this line of study, this line of investigation, will forever be ongoing in Turkey and will forever be ongoing in Anatolia. So I think that it's an exciting period. I really thank Mrs. Lambropoulou and her colleagues for working with us. They were extremely forthcoming in a set of complicated negotiations that we did with our university, our foundation, their foundation. And we will be able to hire new faculty. We will be able to support postdoctoral students. We will be able to support PhD students. We have support for excavations. We have support for all components and dimensions of archaeological science. And the university, of course, provides its capabilities in technical laboratories, scientific laboratories, and in scientific research. This is, of course, very much a research university. At all of our 6 schools, our main interest is research. And our main interest is uncovering the unknown and providing it for the service of people. In doing so, we are also, of course, educating the next generation of engineers, scientists, social scientists, the doctors and the lawyers and other professionals. But most importantly, we are educating the next generation period of people who will have an appreciation of culture, who will have an appreciation of cultural heritage that we share in this region with all the past and current inhabitants of this fantastic region of the world. So I am thrilled to speak here. I thank all of you for coming. It's a very exciting program, so the last thing I want to do is to stand in the way of you and the program. So thank you very much, and welcome all of you.
Thank you very much, Professor Inan, for your message. Ladies and gentlemen, we are proud to welcome today one of the world's leading private international philanthropic organizations, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. Joining us from the foundation today is Christina Lambropoulou. Ms. Lambropoulou has served as the foundation's group CFO since 2009. Before joining the foundation, Ms. Lambropoulou was head of wealth management and distribution at Citibank. The last of many impressive roles she served throughout her 24 years at Citibank. Please join me in welcoming Christina Lambropoulou.
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. Today, I believe, is a significant moment for our respective organizations, as today could be viewed as an educational landmark, a landmark that has been achieved through close collaboration between two organizations that share some of the same fundamental principles in their commitment to education as being one of the main pillars for any sustainable, engaged, and ultimately egalitarian society. Some of you may know already about the foundation and its philanthropic activity, but I would like to take this opportunity and briefly describe who we are and what we do, for those of you who may not know much about us and our work. The foundation first of all, it's an international philanthropic organization. It was established by a visionary businessman, the late Stavros Niarchos. The foundation began its philanthropic activity in 1996, and since then, it has committed a total of 1.5 billion euros through more than 3,000 grants to non-profit organizations in 111 nations around the world. Education is one of the core pillars of the foundation's grant-making activity, together with arts and culture, social welfare, and health and sports. In the last 19 years, the foundation has provided extensive funding worldwide for various causes, among which is the development and implementation of new and innovative educational approaches, the promotion of Greek studies, the promotion of culture and civilization, both in Greece and abroad, as well as the provision of those critical tools that may guarantee the educational advancement of all students, irrespective of their social, financial, cultural, or ethnic background. As a result, we are very proud of the fact that 30% of the Foundation's total grant-making activity has been allocated to benefit a wide range of educational programs and causes around the world. I could not, of course, continue to talk about our work without mentioning Greece and the perilous states it finds itself in. I think you all know what has been happening in Greece in the last years. The consequences of the prolonged socioeconomic crisis have been felt by a very large percentage of the population and has impacted severely the most vulnerable segments of the society. As a philanthropic institution, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, and as a mandate from its founder that at least 50% of its funding has to go to Greece, we had to address the issue of the crisis. For this reason, the Foundation, in the last 3 years, in addition to its regular grant-making activity, has launched 3 significant initiatives of 100 million euros each. The first one was launched in 2012 and is now completed and aimed at addressing the adverse effects of the crisis by giving support to those that were in need. The second initiative was launched in 2013 and it's still under implementation, and it aims to address the issue of very high unemployment among the young, among the youth in Greece, seeking to provide and create better employment opportunities and new opportunities for the young children in Greece. The third initiative was launched in June this year, and again, it aims at providing immediate relief support to the most vulnerable segments of the society, which have been hit the hardest by the crisis. Last but not least, our commitment to Greece and its future can be manifested through the Foundation's largest single gift, a gift of 600 million euros, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Cultural Center in Athens, which is scheduled to be completed in 2016. The project is designed by the Italian architect Renzo Piano, and it includes the new facilities of the National Library of Greece, the Greek National Opera, as well as a park of 170,000 square meters. The Stavros Niarchos Foundation Cultural Center is not only a testament and commitment to Greece's future, but will also be and is already an engine for for short-term and medium-term financial stimulus for the country. All the initiatives that I have just described to you, as well as our fund-making activity overall, are guided by two fundamental principles. The one is to provide support to the most vulnerable segments of any society, those who are most in need. And the second principle is to build solid foundations in order for the prosperity and for the well-being of the future generations. We believe that education plays an ever-increasing role in achieving the latter objective, and for this reason, the Foundation continues to support several initiatives worldwide and seeks to find partners who share the same vision and are willing to work with us to successfully complete such efforts. And this is why we're here today. In partnering with Koç University to establish the Center for Late Antique and Byzantine Studies, we are collaborating with an academic institution that has rigorous educational and intellectual standards. Did I do something? I guess I pressed something. It's okay. So we're collaborating with an academic institution of very high standards, both intellectual and academic, and an institution that has built, I would say, an exceptional reputation, both domestically and internationally, and one which is important for us that places equal emphasis on teaching and research. With excellence and innovation in the core of your educational philosophy, I believe that Koç University has the ability to attract top-notch international faculty, as well as an excellent student body, which are both very essential components for a very successful and high-rate graduate program. At this point, I would like to mention that our decision to move ahead with the collaboration and the establishment of the center was to a great degree determined by our previous excellent collaboration with the Vebi Koç Foundation for the restoration of the Taxiarches Church in Ayvalık. In the Vebi Koç Foundation, we have found a partner that fully understands, respects, and promotes the importance of the shared cultural and historical heritage of our two countries. Over the years, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation has supported several programs and initiatives that aim to study, preserve, and promote Byzantium's rich and important cultural and historical heritage. Whether it is providing support to the University of Notre Dame at South Bend, Indiana, in the United States, or supporting the seminal exhibits at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which made Byzantium's extraordinary artistic legacy known to millions of visitors, our approach has always been to focus on making Byzantium accessible and familiar to a wide range of audiences, whether academic or lay. Our objectives were perfectly aligned with the efforts of Professor Inan and his colleagues to set up the first Center for Late Antique and Byzantine Studies in Turkey. And as Professor Inan said, located in the place which constituted the heart of the Byzantine Empire, the place that has conserved some of the finest and most extraordinary monuments of its legacy, and the place that manifests in so many ways its monumental interaction with the Islamic culture and civilization. We believe that the center is in the unique position to offer students both at the master and PhD level a wide array of courses on Byzantine studies, while operating at the same time as an active hub for researchers pursuing archaeological field projects. Also, through lectures, through a series of lectures, publications, the center will further encourage the study and understanding of Byzantine history, both within and outside Turkey, continuing the rigorous research tradition of the university. Before I conclude, I would like to extend a personal thank you to Mr. Rahmi Koç on behalf of the Board of Directors of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, and also express our deepest gratitude to Professor Inan for embracing this initiative and supporting it right from the beginning, but most importantly, for creating an open, transparent, interdisciplinary environment where critical thinking, innovation, and collaboration across all levels is actively pursued and encouraged. We truly believe at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation that education and culture can bridge gaps, can eliminate differences, can bring people and countries closer to each other, and can form powerful collaborations which may indeed change the world and set the foundations for a better future. Let's hope that today is the first of many more similar initiatives and collaborations to follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Lambropoulou, for your kind words. Our first academic speaker this evening is our very own Director of the Center for Late Antique and Byzantine Studies, Professor Engin Akyürek. Professor Akyurek has held a number of important positions, teaching and researching art history. Before joining Koç University in 2014, he was professor at Istanbul University. As well as director of the new Center for Late Antique and Byzantine Studies, Professor Akyurek also teaches within Koç University's Department of Archaeology and History of Art. Please join me in welcoming Professor Akyurek to the stage.
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests. Welcome to the opening ceremony of Late Antique and Byzantine Studies, GABAM in Turkish we call it. My presentation will be on the history of Byzantine studies in Turkey. Of course, it's a long story, but I will mention only certain turning points concerning Byzantine art history and archaeology. Modern Republic of Turkey has been founded on the core of the Byzantine mainland, that is Constantinople, Anatolia, and Eastern Thrace. On this land, Byzantine civilization survived for more than 11 centuries, exceeding any other historical civilization in Anatolia. It is a fact that the Byzantine cultural remains that succeeded to survive today form one of the major parts of the country's cultural heritage. However, when we look to the scholarly studies on Byzantine civilization in Turkey, though promising recent developments, it is far from being satisfactory. In 2015, we are celebrating the opening of the first scientific center on Byzantine culture in Turkey. However, many countries, not to mention United States and many European countries, but remote island countries like Australia and Japan had their Byzantine research centers for many years. Scientific interest to Byzantine civilization in Europe began at the end of the 19th century. The first periodical on Byzantine culture, Byzantinische Zeitschrift, published its first issue in 1892. At the beginning, this interest was mostly limited to those in Italy, that is Ravenna, Venice, and Sicily. Some Western archaeologists and art historians shifted their interest to Ottoman lands in the first decade of the 20th century and made excursions in Anatolia to find and to study archaeological ruins, mostly Byzantine. Also, ongoing excavations in Anatolia, in Western Anatolia especially, began to show interest to Byzantine remains, which were previously neglected. Parallel to Europeans, Ottoman citizens, mostly amateurs from the Christian minority, began to be interested in Byzantine monuments during the last years of the Ottoman Empire. The publications were mostly in French. The first book published in Ottoman was a monograph on Kariye Mosque by Mehmet Ziya Bey in 1908. In Istanbul, one of the first excavations at a Byzantine site was conducted by Membori and Demangel in 1921-1922 at the Church of St. George of Mangana, which was encouraged and supported by the French occupation forces in Istanbul. Following the declaration of the Republic in 1923, studies on history and archaeology began to be encouraged and supported by the state. Students of archaeology and related fields were sent to Western universities for their education. Several archaeological excavations were supported and even directed by the state. However, archaeological studies in the young republic were concentrated on pre-classical civilizations of Anatolia, which aimed to prove that there were great civilizations in Anatolia before the Roman and Hellenistic periods, and to search for the roots of the Turks in connection to those earliest Anatolian civilizations. Byzantine culture was not completely neglected. It was only that investments in the archaeological studies of the Byzantine period was not one of state's cultural priorities. In 1931, Fuat Köprülü published a book on the effects of the Byzantine institutions on the Ottomans. Some important literature on Byzantine art, Byzantine history, began to be translated into Turkish. A storybook on Byzantine history written for children by Reşat Ekrem Koçu in 1934 is an interesting detail to mention. Even today, there is no book for children to allow them to learn Byzantine history. In the second quarter of the century, we may list several excavations at Byzantine sites and monuments, conducted especially in Istanbul by the Turkish archaeologists. In 1930, excavations at Balabana Mosque, a converted Byzantine church, was conducted by Professor Arif Müfit Mansel. This was the first excavation by a Turkish scholar at a Byzantine site. In between 1940 and 48, the Region excavations at Küçükçekmece was carried out by Arif Müfit Mansel and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. Excavations at two important Byzantine cities at Antalya, initiated by Professor Mansel, again from Istanbul University, Perge in 1946, and Side in 1947. The 1950s and 60s were critical in terms of Byzantine heritage, especially in Istanbul. An incredible wave of migration from Anatolia increased the population of the city by 130% in less than 10 years, which resulted in a rapid and unplanned urban transformation, destroying the historical tissue of the city. Through the public improvement activities, many Byzantine buildings were revealed and destroyed without any documentation. One of the important events in 1950s was the 10th International Byzantine Congress, which held in Istanbul in 1955. The Congress was of great success, and 115 contributors presented papers on Byzantine art and history. Proceedings published in 1957. In 1950s and 1960s, Byzantine art history began to be taught at the Turkish universities. At the beginning, Istanbul University played the leading role. Between 1941 and 1944, Stephen Runciman was invited to give lectures at the Istanbul University on Byzantine art history. In 1943, Ernst Diaz included a certificate program on Byzantine art. This was the first academic program on Byzantine art history in Turkey. After 1956, the courses on Byzantine art began to be given by Professor Semavi Eyici. In 1964, the Byzantine art history was founded as an independent chair within the History of Art department in Istanbul University. In 50s and 60s, foreign institutes, particularly Dumbarton Oaks Research Center, had great interest in the Byzantine studies in Istanbul. Just to give an idea, between 1951 and 1966, 11 of the 13 field research supported by the Institute were projects on Byzantine sites in Istanbul. Studies with regard to Byzantine art began to be spread over to the other universities in Turkey after 1970s. This important development was initiated by Eyice's lectures on Byzantine art at Hacettepe University in Ankara between 1971 and 73. In 1990s, there were Byzantine art history sections in 4 universities: Istanbul, Hacettepe, Anadolu, and Ege universities. In the first decades of the 21st century, the developments in the field are promising. Today, there are many academicians working on Byzantine art history in various universities in Turkey. Just to mention the number of the professors working in the field will give an idea. Today, there are 13 full professors working in different universities on Byzantine art history and archaeology, while 10 years ago, this number was only 3. Impact of this development could be felt in the increasing number of the research in the field, which is evident in the volumes issued annually by the Ministry of Culture, publishing the papers of the Spring Conference, communicating the previous year's field surveys and excavations. One of the major absences of Turkey in terms of Byzantine studies was a national committee, and in 2001, National Committee of the Byzantine Studies in Turkey, established by the contribution of the Byzantinists in Turkey. In 2007, the Vehbi Koç Foundation and Koç University organized the triennial International Sevgi Gönül Byzantine Studies Conference in memory of Sevgi Gönül. In a short time, the symposium, with its high scientific quality and standards, recognized globally and became one of the respected and important scientific symposiums in the field. The path leading to this important symposium was paved by the encouraging pioneers. Most important one was in 1999, the workshop organized by Boğaziçi University and French Institute of Anatolian Studies in Istanbul. Byzantine Constantinople, monuments, topography, and daily life. This was important for being the first international symposium on Byzantine studies since the International Byzantine Congress in 1955. Moreover, it was important to verify the increasing share of the Turkish scholars in the field since 1955 Congress. In 1955, only 9 papers out of 115 were submitted by the Turkish scholars, while in Boğaziçi workshop, 14 papers of 13 were given by the scholars from the Turkish universities. Another important development deserves to be mentioned here as a promising work for the future of the Byzantine studies in Turkey. There are thousands of Byzantine buildings in Turkey, but we do not have a complete inventory of this vast treasure. Turkey's Archaeological Settlements project attempted to make an inventory of Byzantine buildings and sites in Turkey, and in 2015 completed the inventory of Byzantine buildings in Marmara region and in Central Anatolia region, publishing over 1,200 buildings and sites in hard copy files, as well as on the internet in Turkish and in English. Institutes such as Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations and Mediterranean Civilizations Research Institute that are affiliated to Koç University and Suna İnan Kıraç Istanbul Studies Research Institute had considerable contributions to the studies in the field with their libraries, research supports, and publications on international level. And finally, in 2015, 2 research centers on Byzantine studies have been founded in prominent Turkish universities. Stavros Niarchos Foundation, Center for Late Antique and Byzantine Studies at the Koç University, and Byzantine Studies Research Center at the Boğaziçi University. I believe the centers would have great impact on the development of Byzantine studies in Turkey. Completing my presentation, I want to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation and to Professor Umran Inan for their support and efforts in establishing this center. I also would like to thank to the communication staff of the university, especially to Zeynep Cengiz, Konstantino Panagopoulos, and Nilay Güler, who made this perfect organization possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Akyurek. Our next speaker this evening is Professor Judith Herrin. Professor Herrin is Professor Emerita of Late Antique and Byzantine Studies at King's College London. Throughout her outstanding career, Professor Herrin has held many of the top academic positions in her field. She is best known for her books, which have been instrumental in bringing the history of Byzantium to a much wider audience. Professor Herrin has received a number of awards, including the Golden Cross of Honor by the President of the Hellenic Republic of Greece. Her current research Interests include women in Byzantium and Byzantium in relation to Islam and the West. I am privileged to present to you and welcome Professor Judith Herrin.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Umran Bey, Madame Lambropoulou, friends, colleagues. I can't tell you what a great pleasure it is and a privilege to be here with you tonight to celebrate this most auspicious ceremony, the celebration of a new center of Byzantine studies, a moment of rejoicing for all who study the civilization of the East Roman Empire that today we call Byzantium, after the name of the original Greek settlement on the Bosphorus, on the site of today's Istanbul. Tonight, I would like to reflect on the impact of the empire and the city of which it was the capital, which lasted over a millennium and was of worldwide importance. It's also an opportunity for me to show you some beautiful pictures and as a way of thanking you on behalf of Byzantine scholars throughout the world for this splendid initiative. Above all, I would like to stress the importance of Byzantium as a link between East and West, its connecting force that brought together different peoples and cultures. It reached even to the Far East and into the West, the far North and the South, as well as taking a vigorous participation in the entire Mediterranean world. Constantinople was founded to create a new Rome closer to the Persian Empire. Persia was such a dangerous rival. And Constantinople was inaugurated on the 11th of May, 330 AD, by Constantine I, who put up his statue on the column in the Forum, which today is at Cembalitas. In addition to pressing military reasons, the East was very important for substances which came from the Far East, particularly substances like ivory, very much in demand in the Roman world for the production of these plaques that were sent out by every new consul when he was appointed, for combs, and even thrones. Ivory was normally from the Indian elephant tusk, and elephants were also much appreciated, always used in triumphs, as you see here on the great sarcophagus in the Archaeological Museum, and of course in battles. From the story of an elephant keeper and his neighbor, the silversmith, preserved in the Parastasis, a little medieval text of the 8th century, we know that one elephant was kept in Constantinople and was commemorated in a huge statue. And of course, the elephant is depicted in the great palace floor mosaic in the Mosaic Museum. Elephants were always associated with royalty, great power, and were highly prized not only in Byzantium, but in the West. The East Roman Empire branched deep into the Far East, the source of so many important substances, spices, silk, lapis lazuli, and fine ceramics. Silk culture, an ancient Chinese art, was imported to Byzantium long before the secret of the silkworm was discovered in the West. And so for many, many years, silks made in Byzantium were used as diplomatic gifts and very important, very highly prized by institutions in the West. Missionaries of the Nestorian definition of Christianity had spread it through the Persian church of the Persian foundation of a Syriac-speaking church in the late 5th century, right across the Silk Route to the Far East of China. And there, it is commemorated in a very massive Syriac inscription on this stele. In the early 7th century, the Emperor Heraclius had contact with China. And we know this only from Chinese sources, which is a reminder of how much very valuable documentation has been destroyed here in Byzantium. All later visitors to the great Khan and Karakorum, or the emperors of China, were amazed to find these Christians in the courts of the rulers, where they had been for centuries. The same Emperor Heraclius defeated the Persians in 628, and that put an end to the rivalry. But he was almost immediately challenged by an even greater rival, the threatening enemy of the tribes of Arabia, who united under the Prophet Muhammad and came out to attack the richest provinces of the East Roman Empire from the 630s onwards. Islam replaced Persia as the foremost enemy of Byzantium and determined its eastern preoccupation for centuries. As the Arab forces came out of the desert, the way that Islam modeled itself on Byzantium can be traced through coin images. On the left, you see an initial direct imitation of the coinage of Heraclius with his two sons. When Justinian II put up an image of Christ on his gold coins in 692, Abd al-Malik minted a standing caliph coin in the bottom right, though this was rapidly replaced by an entirely aniconic issue with no figures. In 962, Caliph Abd al-Malik built the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, its form modeled on the dome of the Church of Hagia Sophia and decorated by Byzantine mosaic workers and tesserae, and decorated also with verses from the Quran, Surah number 19, I quote, "It is not fitting to Allah that he should beget a son, Jesus, son of Mary, your prophet and servant." This claim that Islam has replaced both Judaism and Christianity and correctly observes the Old Testament ban on the making and veneration of idols provoked an enormous battle over religious images in Byzantium. Iconoclasm was a direct result of this clash. In Constantinople, figural decorations were destroyed or covered up, as at Kalendahani Jami, Church of the Panagia Kyriotissa, where I worked in the 1970s. Leo III and his son Constantine V rebuilt the Church of Hagia Sophia in the 780s with the symbol of the cross and a long inscription in the apse, no figural representation. But after the restoration of orthodoxy in 843, the representation of holy persons was resumed, and the mosaic of the Mother of God in Hagia Sophia and at the Church of the Dormition in Iznik, Nicaea, which was destroyed in the early 20th century. If I can make the pointer work, I would show you the... You may see the very faint arms of the cross behind the standing Virgin in the church in Nicaea. Originally, there had been a monumental iconoclast cross, which was replaced after 843. Now, at the same time as the Byzantine and Arab rulers were fighting each other, Islam was seeking access to ancient Greek culture, especially through the medium of Syriac, translations made from ancient Greek, and particularly in the fields of mathematics, philosophy, and astronomy. In the mid-9th century, when a Greek prisoner of war in Baghdad demonstrated his knowledge of Euclid, the caliph invited him to stay or to send an expert, for the Emperor Theophilus to send an expert in such mathematics. This request was refused, and instead the expert, Leo the mathematician, also known as a philosopher and a poet, was established in the Mangana Palace in Constantinople. There he taught texts like the astronomy of Ptolemy, which we call by its Arabic name, the Almagest, Over the course of much diplomatic exchange, a degree of mutual respect was created between the two powers, based initially on this exchange of ancient Greek culture, later on architecture, palace ceremonial, and the lavish banquets and receptions associated with medieval diplomacy. The rivalry between the two centers is clear from the Crown of Baghdad monument, set up in 762 to rival the statue of Justinian on horseback in Constantinople. But this gradually gave way to greater imitation and technical exchange. By the 10th century, this accommodation was replaced by a Byzantine offensive of reconquest, but it came to an end with the settlement of the Seljuk Turks in central Anatolia. In a dramatic shift, invading forces captured the Emperor Romanos IV at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 and made Konya their capital. While their spectacular decorations did not avoid figural representation and led to much greater artistic freedom, their military conquests brought antagonistic Eastern powers ever closer and closer to Constantinople. Now, turning to the West, Byzantine relations with the West are more frequently studied because much diplomatic activity is recorded in the early Middle Ages and was preserved in Latin sources, Western sources. Constantinople used any excuse to exercise pressure in the Western Mediterranean. In the 530s, Emperor Justinian intervened, and the reconquest of North Africa, Italy, and southern Spain was commemorated in imperial panels at the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna. It's very important to remember that these are most unusual panels right in the apse area of the church, and there are no comparable records of such images in churches in Constantinople. Indeed, all the local and contemporary images of Justinian and Theodora in Constantinople have perished. But these, I suggest, were a constant inspiration to rulers of the West who went to Ravenna to admire what it was like to be a real emperor. Marriage was also used to, first we have gifts, I do beg your pardon. Diplomacy always accompanied by gifts. Gifts of silk, gifts of crosses, gifts of relics. And in the 560s, the Emperor Justin II and his wife Sophia sent this cross to Pope John III, which is preserved in the Vatican Library. Silks were often used as shrouds. For example, the charioteer silk, top left, was used to wrap the bones of Charlemagne in 814. And again, when his tomb was opened in the year 1000, the elephant silk at the bottom. Rivalry over the imperial title between the East and the West continued for centuries. Now we come to the use of marriage to sustain relations between Byzantium and the West. For example, the marriage of Theophano to Otto II in 972, commemorated in both ivory, and a splendid marriage contract which is painted on a parchment but which had been prepared to look like a Byzantine silk. And the son of this marriage, Otto III, demonstrates the huge potential influence that would have resulted from the projected union between Otto and Princess Zoe, the daughter of Constantine VIII. This was destroyed by the emperor's premature death in 1002, just as Princess Zoe arrived in southern Italy. She was sent home and raised 4 men to the position of emperor. The portrait of her third husband, Constantine IX, was inserted into the mosaic in the gallery in Hagia Sophia. Relations with the West were permanently soured by the devastation of the Fourth Crusade, which captured Constantinople in 1204. Yet later emperors continued to try and attract Western military help as the Ottoman Turks crossed over into Europe and began their conquest of the Balkans. In 1399, Manuel II Paleologos, set off on a fundraising tour of the West, visiting Venice, Milan, Paris, and London, without success. Perhaps the centre could set up a visiting scholarship to exchange students between Istanbul and London. Call it the Paleologos Scholarship. Manuel's son, John VIII, agreed to a union of the Eastern and Western churches in 1438 in an effort to obtain military assistance. And he took a huge party of over 800 from Byzantium to Italy. Gozzoli later painted his entry into Florence as if he were one of the three magi. But at the terms of the union, subordination of the Patriarch of Constantinople to the Pope of Rome were immediately repudiated in Byzantium. As a result, after many sieges, the fall of Constantinople to Ottoman control was finally successful on the 29th of May, 1453. The young Mehmed II overcoming the last emperor, Constantine XI. In conclusion, Byzantium was a center that linked East and West, the hub through which so many contacts passed. Marco Polo and his uncles set off for China from Constantinople. But it was also a link between North and South, Russia and the Sinai, both Orthodox regions. And most visitors who passed through the city were greatly influenced by their experience, as recorded both by devout pilgrims and hostile witnesses. By looking both east and west, Byzantium developed a particular skill in acquiring reliable information about distant regions. The court carefully balanced diplomatic relations. For example, it used a heavier gold seal for communications to the caliph than that to Western rulers. And it employed military experts, merchants, spies, and translators to keep its information up to date. Many of these traditions were maintained after 1453. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire employed traditions going back to Roman and Byzantine times to build the most impressive monuments, to maintain skilled artists and workers, to develop and enhance its own skills. A notable inheritance that was sustained into the 20th century. Byzantium has no single heir. It belongs to the world and is studied in regions like Japan that had no contact with its medieval achievements. Yet its heritage is now part of modern Turkey, and this makes you here in Istanbul the curators of a world civilization. I salute the foundation of the center and wish it a great success. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Herrin. Our last speaker today is Professor Jim Crow. Although based at the University of Edinburgh, Professor Crow has had a long association with Turkey and is currently a member of the research committee of the British Institute in Ankara. His current role at the University of Edinburgh is Professor of Classical Archaeology and Head of Archaeology. Please join me in proudly welcoming Professor Jim Crow.
Thank you very much. I feel duly honoured to be asked to talk this evening at the initiation of a very important new centre, one hopes, which will provide the focus for new research, both in terms of archaeology and in the cultural history and other areas of the Byzantine past within Istanbul and across Turkey. But as we've heard, the study of the Byzantine world is not the study of simply Constantinople. It is a much broader world which extends across the Balkans and is respected across the world. My talk is going to become a little more focused, however. I don't want to start in a cistern, although it provides us an instance of my first of the three themes that I'll be talking about. The first of them is perhaps less well known, and that is the Scottish. I'm a professor at the University of Edinburgh. That is the Scottish dimension in the discovery of the Byzantine past. The Sistine photograph shows on the right David Talbot Rice, and on the left Stanley Casson, as part of the excavations, the report of the excavations carried out on the Hippodrome in 1927. But what's less well known is that the major excavations of the Great Palace mosaic, both before and after the Second World War, were carried out through a Scottish initiative. It was the excavations funded by the Walker Trust, a private trust, of St Andrews University, which we can see from this photograph, taken from the minaret of the Sultan Ahmed Jami, looking down onto the Arashta Bazar. And it is this headline from the London Times, in which you'll see a new Turkey and Scots excavation. It's actually a supplement for the issue. It's not the main headline of the Times, but it's an indication of the significance in the late 1930s of these events and how they were perceived both in Britain and elsewhere. And I draw your attention to a promising discovery made this summer by a party of archaeologists who, aided by Scottish munificence, have begun the excavations at the Great Palace of the Byzantine emperors. And if you read on, there's a piece by J.B. Bury, the most eminent Byzantine British historian of his time. And this is the Arashta Bazar. You don't know it like that today, I know, but that's how it appeared after the Great Fire, before the First World War, and at the time of the excavations by the St Andrews team. Now, the St Andrews team was not entirely successful, and a second team, this time from the University of Edinburgh, was drawn in, again funded by a Scottish foundation, the Russell Trust, also of Fife, and this was led by David Talbot Rice, who was in that first photograph, and from 1934 until his death in 1972 was Professor of Art History at Edinburgh and was one of the leading Byzantine art historians of his age, but was as much interested and active in the field of Byzantine archaeology. I show you here just simply the second Great Palace report, which was edited by Talbot Rice, and also to remind you of Talbot Rice's other activities, particularly the initiative for the cleaning and the presentation work carried out by the late David Winfield in the Church of Hagia Sophia in Trabzon. So that's really to set the scene, both of Scottish initiatives, but also a private engagement in Byzantine studies. We're here in a private university, and the importance of those projects, both before and after the Second World War, was through one simple local trust which was interested in the archaeology of Anatolia and largely funded British activities throughout the 1960s and 70s. But what I really want to talk about is to say something about my own projects, because I'm not saying this is how Byzantine archaeology should fare in the future, but it gives you some insight of how things may well develop, and how Byzantine archaeology in itself need not be something trailing in the coattails of classical archaeology as it formerly has been. In the past, I've been involved in the investigation and the mapping of the great water supply of Constantinople, and this was published in a volume by my colleagues Jonathan Bardell and Richard Bayliss in 2008. And that grew out in turn a project that we initiated nearly 20 years ago with Alessandra Ricci, now of Koç University, looking at the Anastasian War in Thrace also. This is the new project, the Leverhulme Research Project, concerned with the engineering of the water supply. Now, we had an exhibition, which many of you saw about 3 years ago in the RCAC, concerned with waters for the capital. And this is on the bottom left, you see Jonathan Bardell and Richard Bayliss in close proximity to a Turkish soldier in the military area at Halkala, looking into the system, and above you can see the late Professor Paolo Bollo of Rome University, La Sapienza, who was a hydrogeologist who worked on that project. What that project was able to do was able to outline the history of the water supply system and also to understand much more fully where it was, and essentially to map it based on initial surveys, particularly by Feridun Dirim-Tikin, who was the director of the Hagia Sophia Museum for many years, up until the late 1960s, and also Professor Kasım Çeçen of Istanbul Technical University. But what do the new projects mean? A project initiated with Istanbul Technical University, but this time with Professor Derya Maktav, was able to use remote sensing technologies in order to try and map and understand the extensive nature of the water supply. And this is the new team, including Dr. Kerim Altuğ, who has recently carried out a doctorate studying the cisterns, cataloguing the cisterns of the city using local records. Now, what we're now looking towards doing is trying to understand the construction processes of which, as Kasım Çeçen rightly noted, was the longest Roman water supply line. And this is where the Byzantine in me comes out, because this is where I say the Romans have got it wrong and the Byzantines achieved a great deal more. Because in a minute you'll see that the water supply for this city was much more substantial and significant than the accumulated water supplies of the city of Rome. This is the plan which Richard Bayliss drew, and you can see that the water supply itself ran as far as Vise on the left. And this, of course, this is only one of the great bridges. This is the greatest of all the bridges at Kurşunlu. These are magnificent monuments, still largely neglected, hidden in forests, but not so difficult to achieve and to visit. And yet they stand, this is a 5th century monument, which was maintained, restored throughout the Byzantine period up until the end of the 11th century. So for almost more than half the life of this great city, as a Byzantine city, these monuments ensured its water supply system. But as yet, still this isn't taken into account, certainly not by the classical archaeologists concerned with water in the ancient world. The evidence for this water supply system is diverse, and we've documented quite a lot of that. But what we're now looking to do is to try and understand in much greater detail how the system was put together and how it may have functioned, taking an engineering and a structural response. This essentially shows the different periods when the system was functioning, when it fell into decline after the Avar siege of 626, and secondly, when it was restored under that great iconoclast emperor, Constantine V. And here you can see how the Ottoman aqueduct system, although it's continued to support the system right up until the 20th century, was a much shorter line, and there are questions about the significance of that. And this compares the length of the Constantinopolitan system with Rome and other great cities. These are all gravity-led systems. In other words, water fed through gravity over long, long distances. There was no pumping, no siphons, and so forth. All these latter images, incidentally, are produced by my colleague Riley Snyder, who completed a PhD at Edinburgh on the construction materials of the aqueduct systems in the Anastasian Wall, is now working as part of the New Leverhulme project. Riley has taken into account the amount of materials used. We'll come back to what these materials mean, but the materials used, and it represents either, that's 2.5 million cubic meters, and the total amount of materials, mortar, used for the construction of the aqueduct channels and the bridges amounted to 456 Olympic-sized swimming pools. He's forever trying to find different means of measuring. He says, should we use a supertanker? Perhaps that would be more suitable from the Niarchos Foundation. Or should we use swimming pools as a way of trying to assess the scale of this undertaking? Because that's what we're looking to do. And from that, you can try and engage the numbers of people involved. In other words, the resources of the state. Remember, we don't have the sort of documents that allow us to be able to assess the scale of this enterprise. So we have to find other proxies, other ways of dealing with it. And what we almost know, we know certain things about the system, but we need to find new things about it. And through the new project, I think we're beginning to understand them. In particular, by taking what is essentially a very transdisciplinary, not interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary approach, which is engaging engineers, in this case engineers from Edinburgh. Previously I've worked in collaboration with other people, but now I have a project within Edinburgh, engineers from the civil engineering department, some of whom you've already seen, and some of whom I'll be seeing later on this evening. And one of them, Kate Ward, who's doing a PhD, is looking at the whole question of demand. And if we want to try and understand the demography of the city inside, demand is a good way of approaching this. First of all, the water comes in, the inflow, then it comes in, then it's dispersed, and then it's used. Now, of course, we do have evidence. There's lots of evidence still surviving. It just needs to be drawn together. In our original study, we didn't have the time and possibly the expertise to draw this together and take out its full meaning. But here you can see photographs, and I'd like to thank Kerim for his assistance in this, photographs from earlier excavations in the city which show tunnels and pipes and channels which have been recorded. And this is Kate's latest attempt to represent the whole line of major channels. This is the arch of the Forum of Theodosius, and running along the messe of the city, and here you can see these areas. This is where channels, these pipes and channels have been found. And we're beginning to try and tangle out what do these actually represent. Because in some areas, clearly, you have channels, and some areas you have stone pipes. You can see a whole bunch of these pipes if you go around the corner behind Hagia Sophia. They're all just sitting there, not explained, but they're all there, taken up from these excavations within the streets of the city. And then Kate went further and tried to document how this might be in terms of a network of water supply, which in turn reflects where people needed water. In other words, going back to this whole question of demand. So we have two networks. We know that there are basically two levels of water within the city, one high level, one low level. And so finally I'm going to show a couple of her uses of different sources. We have very limited sources for most of the time, specific sources. This comes from the early 5th century Notutia Urbis. This is the distribution of bakeries according to districts of the city. This is the distribution of public and private baths within the city. And then this is what Kate, taking her engineering perspective, looking at demand, begins to see about the potential distribution of the city in the 5th century. So those are just some of the ways that we're looking at the city, both from outside and from inside. From what that means in terms of the large-scale construction of the water supply system, its maintenance, and how we can understand that, and we can then move on to trying to develop a better understanding of how the population was dispersed. And finally, and very briefly, I want to talk about another aspect of the Byzantine world, and this time not in Thrace or Constantinople, but I want to go to Naxos, the largest of the islands of the Cyclades, which is pointed there. And this is a project which I started with my colleague Sam Turner at Newcastle, and it was a remote project. It didn't actually need us to pick up anything, to dig anything, to record anything on the ground. It was based essentially using satellite images, air photographs, and a technique called historic landscape characterization, which has been used extensively in northwestern Europe, particularly in Britain, but elsewhere in the Benelux and France. This looks at the time depth of landscape archaeology. This is different from the standard approach of archaeologists in the field where they collect ceramics, and we shall see the collecting of ceramics in order to establish where sites are, but this is trying to look at the wider use of the landscape and then to locate settlements. Now you can say, why did we select Naxos? It wasn't just the beaches. They're all right. Lots of islands have got nice beaches. The Sea of Marmara has nice beaches. The reason was this island has the largest concentration of Byzantine churches virtually in the whole world, apart perhaps from parts of Cappadocia. There are 150 small Byzantine churches dating from late antiquity, some from the 6th century, right up until after the Venetian conquest, into the 15th century. So Naxos is an exceptional island in terms of the preservation of its ecclesiastical archaeology, but the fact is you can integrate that ecclesiastical archaeology with the landscape archaeology, which is what makes it interesting for us. At the same time, a Norwegian team from the University of Oslo were interested in a fortress, a Byzantine fortress, at the southern end of the island of Naxos, Paleologos. Now, Paleologos is extraordinary. It's 500 meters high and has an extensive settlement. And this is what my Norwegian colleagues have been studying for the last 3 or 4 years. And so, with the encouragement of the Greek Ministry of Culture, the Universities of Edinburgh, Newcastle, and Oslo are now involved in a combined project looking but not only at the landscapes but also at the major settlements from the Byzantine period. And I think that's the sort of approach which I think can have great benefits for the future. This is an air photograph of Paleologos. And here you can see that remains, that's the photograph, this is the plan, which the most recent plan, which the Norwegians have produced. And here you can see it's a planned settlement on the top of this very high hill, and what that means. Now, the chronology of this seems to date from the 7th century up until the Venetian conquest in the early 13th century, with its major period of occupation probably in what has often been misleadingly called the Byzantine Dark Age. But what particularly interests us, the Norwegians are above us, we're simply below us, is the fact that there is a landscape associated with the fortress, a landscape with churches, and a landscape with houses and fields and terraces. And it's documenting that and teasing out the time depth, as we call it, in trying to see the chronology of it and taking it back from the contemporary world into as far back into the past as we can go, but particularly concentrating on this medieval period. That was merely the approach to Paleologos, and this is the plan what we produced over the last 2 summers of a village and terraces below the fortress. The fortress is on the right on this slide, but all the terraces and little houses, those are not fully studied. We were working on it last summer, we worked on it the summer before. The ceramics all seem to date predominantly in the period between the 7th century and the beginning of the 11th century, which is a period about which we know least. But it is, of course, a period where there is this extraordinary and exceptional presence in terms of ecclesiastical buildings in Naxos. Basically, an iconic painting. So we've heard from Judith Herrin's talk about iconoclasm and significance of iconoclasm across Byzantine culture and its resonances around the Mediterranean world. But again, there are patterns across the Byzantine world of not just figurative art, but also an iconic art. And Naxos is especially important, and this has been documented by Greek art historians for many years. But the aniconic churches, we can situate them into the landscape, and they enable us to actually give a presence, a chronology, so we can use the art history and the landscape studies associated with the building archaeology all together to create a fuller picture. So this was a study of a laser-scanned survey of the inside and the outside of one of these churches, the church of Iosianis at Adisaro. And you can see just about here, you can see the paintings, very distinctive, very unusual paintings in the Byzantine world. And there are 3 or 4 major examples of this in Naxos and many other fragmentary examples which have been documented. This is another example, again from the same church. But what I want to conclude with is the importance of this archaeology of monuments, whether the Castro at Paleologos or the churches themselves within a landscape which has been relatively unchanged, and that's what's important. Using, for instance, photographs taken by the Royal Air Force during the Second World War, we can look at the fields and the terraces and we can say that essentially they have not radically altered since the 1940s. And that in turn allows us to look back in time. Not everywhere in the Byzantine world is the same, whether we're talking about Greece, Bulgaria, or Turkey. But there are many places which are. We need to look. And this is just one area. This is not in the south of the island. This is towards the center near Halki. And here you can see the way that these are the churches, these are the terraces and the fields, and it's this final slide I want to show you. You can see these two churches, Ios, Isideros, and the Church of the Taxiarchis. Both of those churches you can recognize, because they have yellow crosses. They're thought to be of the earlier period, the early medieval period, and you can see how they exist, looking at the landscape and looking at the fields. They exist within liminal zones, and their significance within a wider space, and that's what we think is important. I want to conclude with this quotation, which I find slightly challenging. It comes from an English shepherd, a clever man who comes from generations of shepherds in the Lake District, which is what the English call mountains. It's the northwest of England. It's a high area. It's wet. It's harsh. And it has very fine sheep. Now, this man left school early, but then went to Oxford. But he wanted to be a shepherd, and he went back to being a shepherd just as his father and his grandfather before him had been. And he wrote this about landscapes. And what I've been talking about is the bigger issues, whether it's the urban landscape or more particularly the rural landscape, whether it's the landscapes of the water supply system and the Anastasian Wall, or whether it's the landscapes of the fields and the terraces of Naxos. Landscapes like ours were created and survived through the efforts of nobodies. The real history of the landscape should be the history of nobodies. The people who built the water supply system and created those thousands and thousands of tons of material which was able to supply are unknown to us. They are effectively the nobodies. The people who created the terraces and the churches of the islands of Naxos effectively were nobodies. But they're not lost. We can still approach them. So I think the challenge for Byzantine archaeologists is that we have real resources available to us, and we need to take them on. And I hope a great centre like this, within this university, supported so warmly by the Niarchos Foundation, will be able to achieve and to move forward from here. Thank you very much.